My talk today is about one topic. And this topic is very dear to me because we've built Centrify based upon this topic. But more importantly for you, it's, in my opinion, the future of cybersecurity. And it's a way we need to start thinking about security moving forward. I'm going to talk about a concept called the zero trust model. It's something that's going through a lot of iterations at the moment, and a lot of people in the security market are talking about it. I'm going to talk about the core concepts of this model, about how to implement this model within your organization, concepts like identity assurance, trusted endpoints, conditional policies, and least privilege. And then I'm going to talk about some major innovations that are happening in the marketplace, which are either going to help really build out zero trust networks, or they're going to exaggerate the need for zero trust networks. And what I mean by exaggerate the need is we're all moving to cloud. We're all trying to do different things. And you're going to soon learn that you really need to implement a zero trust network. So let's get to the basics first. What is a zero trust network? And trust is something really complicated, and I want to be able to really walk you through some of the examples of how to describe this. But let's give you some background first. Zero trust networks was first coined by the Forrester Analyst Group. They've got a lot of material on their website about what it means to be a zero trusted network. But it's really recently gained a lot of prominence in the marketplace because Google actually has built their own zero trust network inside their whole company. And they've branded it Beyond Corp. There's a recent O'Reilly book that I recommend you give to IT and security staff within your organization to understand zero trust. But let me walk you through what zero trust really means, because it's kind of complicated in a way. But let me use a very simple example. You're at home. You're in bed, you're asleep, you have a sense of security and inherent trust because the windows and doors are closed. Yeah? Now, for a second, imagine all the windows and doors are open. How do you feel? What are you going to change about your environment now because all the windows and doors are open? Maybe you're going to put a lock on the bedroom door. Because let's face it, most of us don't have a lock on the bedroom door. And remember this example because I'm going to use it later on when I talk about things. Let me give you another example. My son recently went to a Maker Faire conference. And he went to one of those workshops on lock picking. He spent 1 hour, and he came out of it and said, "Dad, I can break into locks." And really, he can. But just think about that for a second as well. We have this inherent security. I used to live in Manhattan. We have this inherent security when we lock our doors that everything's safe. But a kid can break into it. So just think about that for a second. So let's now get back to security and cybersecurity for a second. We, in cybersecurity world, have to really think differently about security. It's a real philosophical kind of subject for us because we've been programmed from day one, from a training perspective, to think that this is bad and this is good. That's not the case anymore. The bad actors are within our network already, and we've got to really get our head around the fact that this is the scenario today. Because if we do, then we're going to start thinking differently about security. Unfortunately, most of us have this kind of training and philosophy where we think that this is good, this is bad. I'm going to have a firewall. My data is going to be protected here instead because the firewall is protecting it already. That's just not the case. So zero trust networks and zero trust model is fundamentally a paradigm shift in the way we think about security. And the second you start thinking that your home is, like I described earlier on, with all the windows and doors open, you're going to think differently about the way you actually implement security in your own environment. So I think the next logical question is, okay, so how do I implement a network where you're not going to trust things? Yeah? So let me walk you through these concepts. So there's 4 key concepts for the Zero Trust model that I'm going to go through in a little bit of detail. One is identity assurance, understanding who somebody is. Number 2, it's trusted endpoints, knowing that this person is coming from a trusted or known endpoint. Number 3, it's what we call conditional policy, combining the aspect about the person and the aspect about the endpoint that person is coming from to give that person access. And lastly, it's least privilege, performing some level of controls on the asset that you're trying to protect, so you've got the least amount of access. Remember I said the door in the bedroom needs a lock? So we need to be able to protect the asset as close as we can to the asset itself. Not far away, but very, very close. And that's one of the key principles of Zero Trust. Now, there's a couple of more principles of Zero Trust that I'm not going to go through today, like end-to-end encryption, like visibility, which I'm going to touch on later on, and about zoning and so forth as well, which I might touch on later on as well. But these are the basic principles. So let me walk you through these, because fundamentally, if you've got a network, imagine this network you've got, and you're not going to trust things. You really need to layer on top of that network a set of controls, a set of preventative controls to give people access to what they need within this world of cloud, mobile, outsourced IT. You know, the fact that we are living in a very irregular, very different world from the world that we started out with is what we need. So, okay, so let me walk you through these concepts. The first concept I explained was identity assurance. Speakers earlier on spoke about identity assurance. I think we all get identity assurance. There's 500 people in this room here. 10% of you have the password. That means those 50 people, the other 49 look exactly like you. So you are choosing to be like everybody else, or everybody else in the other 50. Right? It's another way of thinking about identity. We need to have unique identity. And multi-factor authentication gives you unique identity. The reason I've labeled this chart MFA everywhere is because MFA has to be implemented for all your users within your organization. Not a subset of your users, but all your users. It needs to be implemented for all the types of accesses: application access, server access, privilege access, VPN access. All accesses have to be protected by MFA. And for those of you who are familiar with legacy solutions in the MFA space, well, the world's changed. It's fundamentally changed. Things are way more simple than what you had before. So you really got to look at solutions that are delivered today in the marketplace. To improve MFA, implement behavior-based access. But behavior-based access, I'm normally not in Midtown. But now I'm in Midtown, I can re-authenticate myself. Now, the other advantage of behavior-based access is it gives you less friction for the end user. The last part of identity assurance is no passwords. So you've authenticated a person, but how does that person get to the application? There should be no passwords. There's SAML is a standard in the marketplace for removing passwords from applications. PKI can be used to remove passwords from servers in the data center. Those things should be implemented immediately. So what have I just talked about? I've talked about identity assurance, understanding that this is built. That's how far I've got now. A core tenet of Zero Trust is understanding that this is built. Let's go to the next one, trusted endpoint. Most of you today are either evaluating or are moving towards next generation endpoint security solutions, away from the old antivirus products. Think Carbon Black, think Palo Alto Networks, and so forth. Those need to be complemented with identity-centric preventative controls on the endpoint as well. What do I mean by that? Number one, implement MFA on those endpoints. So when I'm using my Windows laptop, MFA from that laptop. So it's Bill accessing that laptop. But number two, implement device identity. If every employee within your organization registers their home device or their personal device, just registers it, then at least you know that this person is coming from a registered device. You can also complement that with setting the security policies, making sure devices are only allowed access if they meet certain security requirements. Hasn't been jailbroken with the phone. What are the VPN settings? Lastly, you can also implement controls for privilege commands as well. Too much privilege on an endpoint means ransomware can be installed on that endpoint. All these controls with next generation endpoints essentially give you a posture for the endpoint. Because imagine this, back to zero trust. If you can't trust anything, you've got to be able to identify the user and now also trust that the endpoint is secure as well. So let's bring these two concepts together. I've got identity assurance and trusted endpoint. It gives me conditional policy. Here's an example of a conditional policy. Here's Alice, can access Salesforce if Alice, so got a spelling mistake in there. If Alice is authenticated with MFA, endpoint security is compliant and endpoint is authorized as well. And the location is New York City. So we've combined concepts together to give access. We don't care about the underlying security. We're making a policy based upon these two decisions. So okay, now Alice has got access to Salesforce. What can Alice do inside Salesforce? Well, that's where least privilege comes in. Because obviously, if Alice is a salesperson, she can look at her territory information. But if she's a manager, she can look at the whole territory information. So there's least privilege implemented within an application. Let's go into that in a little bit more detail. Let me give you an example first of least privilege that you can use to explain to people in your company. When kids come to my son's party, he takes his Lego, Star Wars Lego, and puts it right at the top of the shelf. What is he implementing? Least privilege. Yeah? That's what we need to implement as well. Here's an example of something that's not right. I'm going to shift from the Salesforce example and give you a server in a data center. Here's Bob. He's got too much access. You can see that he's got too much access because the risk level is high. And he's got a flat line in terms of access. At any point in time, every person in your organization should have zero access. They should only have access when they need it. Just imagine now, everybody in this room, you're listening to me. That means you're not doing something else. That means all those systems that you would have access to, they've been disabled miraculously. It's only when you need that access should you have that access. This is unfortunately what we see in a lot of deployments where you go into a data center and you find out that system administrators have got full access to the root account. No wonder the bad guys get in. What should be done instead is Bob authenticates as himself. That's a really important concept because if you know it's Bob is authenticating as himself, you can at least tie back all the access back to Bob. Then Bob requests permission to do something special, let's say with ServiceNow, performs the action by re-authenticating. Remember the term continuous authentication was brought up earlier on? Performs the tasks, and then goes back to the normal access. There's another reason I'm actually showing this particular example. When the bad guys break into our data centers, they don't go in, steal 1 million records and walk out. That's not what they do. What they do is they make surgical changes to your environment over a long period of time. And those surgical changes are made on configuration files. And this is exactly how they try and get into an environment. But if you implement least privilege, and you've got controls like MFA, you've controlled the environment for yourself. So now I've described to you the principles of zero trust. Identification of a user, trusted endpoint, conditional access, least privilege. Let me move towards some of the innovations happening in the space. One of them is machine learning. The whole security industry at the moment is buzzing around machine learning, right? So much investment is going into machine learning at the moment because we all know we're going to be able to do some really smart things around security, around security with machine learning concepts. Let me give you an example of what we're trying to do with machine learning as it pertains to zero trust models. Let's go back to the original diagram here. Every one of these components of this access, the user, the endpoint, the application or server, the policies, all the activities and so forth are all generating data. And that data can be fed into a data pool. And then from that pool, we can use machine learning to do really interesting things. Simple things like allow the access, stop the access, enforce another level of authentication. If Bill is accessing outside of his location, let's re-authenticate Bill. Provides insights into access. But more importantly, change roles and change policy. Because let's face it, managing an environment like most of us have today with cloud, mobile, outsourced IT, et cetera, is getting more and more complicated. And we need the systems to self-regulate themselves and tell us when policies need to be changed and so forth. So I think machine learning is going to play a big part in this move towards zero trust models. Let me talk about one other area. Dreamforce is happening actually this week, and to quote Mark Benioff, he says the cloud is a state of mind. What does he mean by that? What he means by that is the cloud is not moving to the cloud. It could be. I think it is. But the cloud is more than just moving to a public cloud. The cloud is about automation. It's getting more optimization from the resources you've got. But let's talk about this from a zero trust perspective. In a traditional data center, you've got human to machine interaction. I used to be an IT guy back in England. I used to log on to a Unix machine and do Oracle DBA work. I interface with the machine, user interface, and there was some level of automation. One of the things that we used to do, and we still do it a lot, check with your IT guys, is you run scripts, and there's passwords within scripts. Guess what the bad guys do? They look at those passwords and they get in. In a zero-trusted network, like I said, you can't trust the interaction between the left and the right-hand side. But things are going to get more and more complicated. For those of you who are moving towards cloud infrastructures, the nature of machines is going to radically change. So I'm sure you've heard of the word ephemeral. I love this word. This word means short-lived. It's like toasters. When a toaster breaks, you don't go fixing the toaster, you throw it away, you restart it. That's what's happening in the data center now. The other thing that's happening in the data center is you don't have the human on the left-hand side. You have machines. So you have machine to machine. One machine may be kicking off 1,000 machines. When there's a high workload, 1,000 machines wake up and do the task. Once the workload's done, they disappear. Question number one is, how do we control security in that environment? And how do we control security if the left and the right-hand side can't trust each other? Because I've already said we cannot have this innate factor of trust between these two environments. So what do you have to do? You need to do things like machine identity. Just like people identity, you have to have machine identity. You have to have encryption between the two. And you got to get rid of those passwords that like I showed you before. And you need to be able to take passwords out of a vault or a safe or some kind of controlled environment via APIs and so forth. Because there's going to be massive automation here. So there's fundamental changes that we have to adapt to because of the nature of how the industry is moving forward with respect to public and private clouds. Let's talk about one other trend and innovation. Building applications. Most of us have learned a lot about building applications. And none of us now want to build monolithic applications anymore. A couple of years ago, we used to all say security was an afterthought. But now I think we've matured enough to say that we know we need to build security within applications. We know that. And it's even more important that we do that now because modern architectures for application developments are scalable, they're composable. And they're composable because we want to be able to scale at scale that we actually haven't been able to define. Every time you do a Google search, there's a microservice running just for you, special one just for you. When it's done, it disappears. One microservice, another microservice, the interaction between these microservices, guess what? You can't trust the network in between. You just can't. So as app developers, you want to build security within microservices. And that's another big innovation happening in the marketplace at the moment. Ask your developers, are you using off-the-shelf authentication, authorization, and auditing components to help them build better security within applications? Okay, so let's go to the last topic. Zero trust is complicated. You've got on-premise, you've got cloud, you've got mobile, and then I'm saying I can't trust my network and the internet connection between them. Yet, when I was at the RSA conference, there was 2,000 vendors. And every vendor you go to tells you a great story about the great security products that they've got. And seriously, I think everybody's got great products. But there's a time and place for buying different tools, but there's a time and place for actually stepping back and saying, hold on, isn't there a lot of commonality between stuff? Tell me, what is the difference between giving somebody access to an application versus giving them access to an infrastructure item like a server? There's a person, there's an endpoint, there's a thing you're trying to protect. It's the same stuff. So why have different systems for it? Why complicate your environment and actually introduce gaps in security as a consequence of having different tools? If you have one tool here and you forget to do something here, if you have two tools, and you do something here, you have to do it here, otherwise you haven't got any consistency. So you really have to look at convergence of tools within your environment. And don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about picking the wrong tools for every job. I'm still talking about picking the best tools. But I'm looking for areas of convergence. It's got to be implemented within your environment. The last example here is the users. There is nothing different between the examples I gave earlier on. Alice was accessing Salesforce. Bob was accessing a server. They're users within the organization. They both need MFA. They're both accessing endpoints. They both have a policy. They both have a location. They both have to go through an approval process. There's nothing different. So let's not confuse our environments by implementing different controls. So what have I really talked about here today? I've talked about a concept which is called the zero trust model. A concept that is really telling us to look deep inside and change our philosophy on security. It's a mindset change that has to be implemented within an organization. If there's one strategy that you can go and implement for 2018, that is the zero trust strategy within your organization. It's not one product, it's not one vendor, it's a strategy for kind of moving forward. It's a strategy for not believing in the perimeter anymore. It's a strategy for understanding and really internalizing the fact that the bad guys are already here, so what are you going to do? What are you going to do about it? And that's really what I want to leave you with today, is adapting your thinking and thinking about a zero trust model. Thank you very much.